from this gentle, quiet man erupts
Yeah.
this
Well,
volcano.
we were all pissed off. He was pissed off. We were mad. It was ridiculous. It was just heartbreaking what was happening and what wasn't happening, which should have been happening. You know, just it's unbelievable.
Really excited as part of the Vermont Humanities Council First Wednesday series to be talking to my buddy here, Dona Ann McAdams, a photographer. I had the pleasure of curating an exhibition of her work that is currently up at the Helen Day Art Center in Stowe through the end of December. It's called Dona Ann McAdams Performative Acts. It was just such a fun show, and it covers a lot of different bodies of her work. People living with mental illness, Appalachian farmers, cloistered nuns, Saratoga racetrack workers, and Dona also is a goat farmer with her husband, Brad Kessler. So there's goats and lots of other animals in it. But today, Dona, I want to really focus on your performance work. You were the house photographer for PS 122 in New York for 23 years. And PS 122 was the most seminal space in Manhattan for experimental avant-garde work. It was extraordinary. And every day you were there in the 80s and 90s, at the edge of the stage with your Leica camera, capturing these moments. And 30 years ago, in 1990, you and I got we got to know each other much better because we were involved in what's called the culture wars. And today's talk is really, I want you to reflect back on those culture wars. But let's set the stage before we go to 1990. And a lot of queer activists and artists began to protest. And you were right there in the streets with ACT UP. And you have in this exhibition an extraordinary photograph. Can you talk about the ACT UP movement and in particular that photograph?
Yeah, well, early on, my really good friend, John Byrne, was diagnosed with GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. And a lot of friends in the East Village performing, dancing scene were getting sick with this strange thing that nobody really knew what it was. And so once we figured out what it was and we realized that there was no support for it in terms of the NIH, National Institute of Health in Washington, ACT UP was formed, and I started to attend meetings and being part of protests. So the photograph that you're talking about is a photograph in front of the Waldorf Astoria. And what ACT UP would often do is they would find out when something was happening, in particular George Bush, 41, is he 41 and the other one's 43? Yes. Whenever if he was around, they would do something. So they knew he was at the Waldorf Astoria, so they got in, dropped a banner out the front of the building, and carried a bunch of coffins that were covered in slogans, expressing their displeasure at what the president was not doing and how many people were dying of AIDS. So that's the photograph that you're talking about, with a sort of saint carrying a coffin, a poet and performer, who we didn't realize was in the photograph until the show was up and on the walls, which is kind of wonderful because now people have another reason to like that photograph.
You know, the photograph's really emblematic, I think, of your work because you don't work as a detached journalist. You don't have an objective difference. You're right embedded in these communities that you have photographed, and you are there in the middle of the street action. You're not in any safe distance, and
right.
You had to jump on a light post or something, didn't you?
Well, yeah, which in order to get some perspective for what I wanted, which was to look down on all these coffins, I pulled the garbage can over, climbed up on top of the garbage can, and then climbed up the light post and sort of, held on to, wrap my legs around. It was like the rope. Remember in high school when you had to climb the rope?
Yeah.
And you had to hold on to the rope? That's what I did. I climbed up. I couldn't do that now, but back then I seemed to be able to climb up pretty successfully.
You remain a pretty fearless photographer even now. You jumped into the Gay Pride March in Burlington with Christine Hallquist and just down the street with her, and there you are.
Right, that's true. But the climbing of lampposts, I'm not sure about that.
Well, let's go back to this context because I think it's important. And so the artists are very much part of ACT UP, and the government's not doing much. And also there was a queer aesthetic that was rising because people were dying, and so there was a lot of body politic that was happening. And Philadelphia had a retrospective of Robert Mapplethorpe, and Senator Jesse Helms didn't like that there was homoerotic photographs. He protested it. The exhibition was supposed to go to the Cochrane Gallery in Washington, D.C. Because of that fears, they canceled the show.
Right.
And then there was another show in Winston-Salem at the Southeast Center for Contemporary Arts of Andrea Serrano's work, and there was His Christ, the photograph of the crucifix in urine, and Congress is all involved saying this is outrageous, this work should not be being supported by us. I'm at the Walker Art Center, Contemporary Art Center in 1990, and we decided to open 1990 with a series called Cultural Infidels. And opening night was Karen Finley. And what was interesting to me is that it hadn't opened yet, but it was sold out. We were doing 3 nights. And the box office calls me over and said, John, these 2 men want to talk to you. And I said, oh, okay. So I went over there and they said, well, we'd like to see the show. And I said, well, it's sold out. I'm sorry, you can come back maybe tomorrow or the next night. They said, no, we're the Vice Squad. The what? The Vice Squad. So what? Okay, why are you here? I didn't know you came to the Walker. It's okay. It's a public institution. And they said, well, we got a complaint. And I said, well, she hasn't performed here. How could someone complain about something? And your photograph that is in this exhibition captures the power and veracity of Karen Finley. Why don't you talk about Karen a little bit?
Well, the photograph that you're talking about is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and she performed that piece at the Pyramid Club in 1989. And she's covered in chocolate, but she's basically talking about Tawana Brawley and what happened around her. And the chocolate was to sort of resemble shit. That photograph, it wasn't really out in the world, except it was used once for a show in Texas somewhere. And somehow they got a hold of it. And, the chocolate smeared woman was born. And that photograph was the photograph that they were really, Jesse Helms in particular was really concerned about because, it was the naked woman covered in chocolate and all the things that it represented. We never really showed that photograph at all. I mean, until this show. This is the first time anybody's actually seen it since I made it back in 1989 to put it up on the wall. It was one of those photographs that was just too hard for Karen to look at and too loaded for me to put into a situation that wasn't really safe, where it couldn't be used out of context, which is exactly what they wanted to do when they wanted the photograph of the chocolate smeared woman. They wanted the photograph of Holly Hughes, the lesbian. They wanted Tim Miller, the gay guy. They wanted John Fleck. But the work that I had to give them was work that would work as propaganda for us. So we could show these performers, my friends, all of them, in a different kind of a light than what they were expecting. So I didn't release any of these sensational photographs, sensational, whatever that means, for any purposes.
For me at the Walker, it was interesting. Of course, the news covered that the Vice Squad came to the Walker, and the Washington Post picked it up in D.C. that the Vice Squad visited the Walker Art Center. So Jesse Helms got hold of that and then decided Karen Finley was obscene. And then you mentioned Holly Hughes, and suddenly Holly Hughes was obscene, and you have a great photo for our talk here about Holly Hughes. Talk about Holly's work a little bit.
Well, Holly, I met Holly for the first time at the Wow Cafe, One Women's World, which is a performance space down the road from La Mama on East 4th Street. And I used to go to photograph performances at the Wow Cafe. And the Wow Cafe is a theater, a collective of women that produces work for women and by women, and it's all run by women. But you know, anybody can come to see the work. It's open to everybody. So I spent a lot of time working and photographing there. And the first time I met Holly, she was doing a piece called The Lady Dick. Eventually, Holly ended up at PS 122 and performed there. And I photographed her most of the times, all the time she performed there. And she performed I'm not exactly which piece it was, that not No Trace of the Blonde. That was with Pam Sneed,
right.
But World Without End, I think, was the piece about her mother that they didn't like. And then John Fleck performed at PS 122. I've got the He, She, Be, She's, and then Tim Miller performed at 122, the other piece. All four of these artists were given NEA grants. They were given money from the what was called the Inner Arts, individual artist grants, Inner Arts for theatrical work. That sort of that was the grant that they applied for, and they all got them, right. And then they immediately got them taken away.
Right. The panel approved them. The chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, John Fromeyer, approved them. And suddenly, Jesse Helms in Congress said, no, these are obscene artists. And
right.
Like, well, wait a minute. So those grants were denied. Now that became the NEA 4 in the
right.
Wars. And you had photographed all of them, and we also are showing a picture of Tim Miller here. And it's so interesting that it's so scary to people, but he's the least scary artist we know. I mean, he's a very productive work. He's still doing amazing work around the country. You've done 4 books with him, I think. So he's very active. But there was nothing ever transgressive about Tim's work. It was so funny that just because he was gay, that people were like, "Oh my God!"
Right.
Talk about the picture here that we have and where it's from.
Well, I think the picture, I'm pretty sure that's from that piece, and it's in the downstairs space of PS 122.
Yeah.
And so what happened was I had the NEA 4, Karen Finley, Tim Miller, Holly Hughes, and John Fleck had all performed at PS 122. The Karen Finley piece in question was not at 122, but she had performed there many times. That was at the Pyramid Club. So I had photographed all four of the pieces that they were kind of upset about. So it was kind of amazing that I had all 4 artists, with the exception of John Fleck. He didn't know him as well, but I was really good friends with Karen and Tim and Holly by that time too, because I had spent so much time at the Wow Cafe and, you know, supporting her work. So that was kind of an amazing coincidence and kind of a royal pain in the neck, because I was the person who had the goods that they wanted, the nasty goods. But I refused to give them what they wanted. I made Tim look like a Boy Scout. Holly Hughes was baking cupcakes for the PTA, and Karen was, you know, at home darning curtains. I mean, the work that I released was work from those pieces, but not sensational work, just beautiful work of them in performance.
Yeah, and
so that's what I did.
There were a lot of protests, of course, across the country, because this really went nationwide with the NEA 4. It wasn't just these New York artists. And you have a great photograph here with Ralph Lee and Allen Ginsberg and others sitting there in a protest. Where was that protest happening?
Well, there was a lot of protest. There was a button Save the NEA, and there was a lot of protests in New York City, in Washington, D.C. I have a picture of Spalding Gray down in Washington, D.C. with a pile of papers on his head. And this particular photograph is at Union Square. And it was people just lined up around a circle. And Ralph Lee, of course, who is the Meadowee Players, who's an incredible puppet artist and wonderful performer, had his little paper mache attachment there, and he sat next to Allen Ginsberg, and then Allen immediately grabbed his hand and looked at me, and it's just kind of a wonderful photograph, I think, and it kind of sums up everything.
And what the NEA did in response is they put in a new clause for everyone who got a grant to have a decency amendment, that you had to say your work was decent. Right. And so at the Walker, like we talked about, I said, well, we don't, of course we're going to sign it. Everything's decent. There's nothing indecent about these artists. But what was interesting to me, Oregon Shakespeare Festival, New York Public Theater, Elizabeth Streb, Bella Lewitsky, the California choreographer, they all refused to sign, which meant they did not get grants. But they took a stand against this. And I called Bella up because I knew her, and I said, Bella, I'm really curious why you did this. And she said, well, you know, I'm older than you are, John, and I lived in California during the McCarthy hearings. And I remember one time there was a knock at my door, and I was getting a subpoena to go testify before the McCarthy hearings. And she said she looked at the person and said, my dear, I am a dancer, not an opera singer, and slammed the door and refused. Mm-hmm. And she said, I refused then and I refuse now.
Yeah.
This is not worth it to do that. Now, sadly, the four NEA artists, the lawyers came and they brought this case of the turn down of the $5,000 grants that they had received all the way to the Supreme Court.
They won in the lower courts.
Okay. Well, describe that, and then we have a beautiful picture of.
They won in the lower courts, and then it was Bill Clinton who sent it to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So the Supreme Court, everybody, you can go to the Supreme Court and sit in the gallery, but on that particular day, and there was buses that came up from New York, but there was you couldn't, there was a big queue to get in. And so I went as Tim Miller's date. I took the train in and I met him, and he and I got to sit right up close to the action. And you couldn't have a pencil. You weren't allowed to write anything. I mean, I'm pretty sure my camera got put into the little, I can't remember. I think it must have gotten locked up into some little security box. We all went there and we all sat there. And the Supreme Court, they have these big chairs and they wiggle all around. There's a bunch of frescoes of, these Greek figures, and they're all kind of, naked. It's kind of like, okay, well, what about those guys up there, guys? Supremes? I call them the Supremes.
As we're talking about the NEA4 and what's happening, artists kept dying, and artists' work kept getting demonized. And another artist that you photographed in the exhibition currently at Helen Day Art Center in Stowe is David Wojnarowicz, the visual artist. And he died in 1992 at the age of 37. But he had a case that also went to the Supreme Court, and he won 2 years before he died, which was really nice because Donald Wildman of the American Family Association had taken some of David's images and misappropriated them and demonized them and did them for a fundraising piece for his conservative faith organization. And the lawyers sued, and so there was a little bit of justice for David, and he is someone who, in death has become very big. I mean, he's had a big exhibition this year, which is 30 years too late. He was not released. But the photograph is that you have, to me, just epitomizes his fierce fragility. Can talk about where that was and what.
Well, that was part of the Decade show, and he's he's reading from Tongues on Fire, I'm pretty sure. So, but I had seen David read many, many times and was a huge fan of his visual art. I mean, he's an incredible artist, and our paths overlapped quite a bit. I mean, he did an installation at the Piers, Pier 34 on the west side by Spring Street, and I did something there too. So I watched him paint in there and photographed that, and we pasted some anti-nuclear posters up there. He was a very, very good friend of Karen Finley's and in the community. And when he died, the day he died, there was a huge march from his apartment down the street. So it was very sad. And his relationship with Peter Hujar, who's an incredible photographer, the loss of those two visual artists and incredible artists way too soon, especially David. So, I mean, his work, his written work and his visual art are, you know, it's incredible, beautiful, and brilliant. And he was a really, really nice guy too. He's very quiet and soft-spoken. He was just a nice guy. You know, you'd see him and hi, for somebody who was very sick, you know,
so sick
for a long time.
But I agree. I knew him through Peter primarily, but we also presented David's work at the Walker, and he backstage he was so feverish, and he was wrapped in these blankets. I didn't think he would actually go on. I said, David, it's okay if you're not feeling well. He said, no. And he got on stage, and he was this fierce, fire artist, and you know, it was him fighting back to live. And the words are so powerful.
Yes.
So from this gentle, quiet man erupts this volcano.
Well, we were all pissed off. He was pissed off. We were mad. It was ridiculous. It was just heartbreaking what was happening and what wasn't happening, which should have been happening. You know, just it's unbelievable.
Well, another iconic image you have in this exhibition is of Ron Athey. And in 1994, I was at the Walker still, and I presented Ron Athey's work, and it was called 4 Scenes in a Harsh Life. And it was with two men, including Ron. And at one point, Ron was raising tattoos on one man's back, so he was kind of using like a razor to just raise the tattoos to get the scarification going, and it did blood prints. And another one, Ron had been interested as a kid. He was a charismatic preacher in the tent shows as a young teenager, and then he became addicted. And so in this next piece, he put needles in his arms, and he's talking about overcoming his addiction.
Right.
And then the piece that I think really got people is when he then did the Saint Sebastian imagery of this photograph that you have in the show, where there's a crown of needles, but it's like acupuncture needles, you know, and then there's pierced sides and stuff. I don't know, talk about Ron's work a little, if you would.
Well, I photographed both of those pieces, the Saint Sebastian piece and the piece that everybody was clamoring about in '94, where he created this human printing press. And I knew going into the show that there was going to be a review. The Times was going to review it. I knew that. But I also knew that I had an agenda as the propaganda person for our team. Well, I needed to take photographs that were essential for who he was and for me to satisfy my requirements of what a good photograph is. So I had that in mind. But the other thing I needed to do was I needed to take a photograph that would illustrate in the paper to everybody who was saying that he was taking HIV positive blood and dripping it and throwing it all over the audience, that he wasn't doing that. So what I did, when the Times called and said, we need a picture of Ron Athey, I said, okay. I gave them a photograph of him doing the human printing press. On the back end of, I'm not going to be able to think of his name now. Anyway, but he was not HIV positive. Divinity Fudge. Yeah. Yes, okay. Right. So, and I also had to crop it so I didn't get his butt, because his butt, you know, I had to strategically frame that. So the photograph is two clotheslines of Ron going out over the audience. So it's absolutely crystal clear that nothing is dripping on the audience. And I remember V. Lowenthal, who was the photo editor at the time, said, "Is this all you have? You're giving me one photograph. Usually you give me a choice." And I said, "No, this is it. This is the picture you have to use. This is the one." So they ran it. And
in Minneapolis, this is how it played out for us. We had it in a 100-seat venue. It was very respectful. It was calm. About 80 people stayed afterwards to have a conversation with Ron.
Yeah.
They really wanted to understand the work, even if it unsettled them. You know, it was like, okay, this is it's powerful art. 3 weeks afterwards, a visual art critic called. Now, she hadn't seen this work. And she said, "Oh my God, I want you to verify that this is what happened." And I said, "It's not what happened. You weren't there." And she spun it. And here's some quotes from her, a review of the piece that she wasn't there to see. "Knife-wielding performer is known to be HIV positive.
Ooh.
The audience knocked over chairs to get out from under the clothesline."
Okay.
All of that was not true. But what happened is, just like with Karen's work and these other artists we're talking about, the media spin began and it went wild. And that summer's NEA buzz about what to do. And
right.
Senator Helms, again, on the floor,
right.
I think, used one of your photos and held it up and said,
"He used the chocolate smeared Karen's photo.
This is a cockroach. This is a cockroach." Yeah. And then
they say, I wasn't in the Senate floor, so I don't know.
Yes. Then I got a call from my mother, and she goes, "Oh my God, what did you do?" I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "I watched Rush Limbaugh last night, late night TV, when he had his right-wing cable show." And I said, "Okay." He was yelling about you for a half hour, about the Walker Art Center and you. I said, "About what?" And she said, "About this buckets of AIDS-tainted blood were intensely thrown at the audience."
Yes.
I said, "Mom, who are you going to believe?"
Well, that's why that photograph was so important.
Yeah.
Important for me to make and important for them to run, because it was clear that there was no buckets of blood. It was clear that, you know, he was using the quicker picker-upper Bounty. He was making the screen prints on a paper towel, you know, and they were beautiful. And they were just going over the audience, absolutely on a clothesline. But sorry, everyone.
But here's what my mother said. She said, "But it was on television."
Yeah.
And I think that was the amazing thing.
Sure.
All of these artists and culture wars that we're talking about is the media spin started hurling out into this stratosphere. And what happened is even the arts organizations start using the deconstructed words from the right-wing media, trying to be supportive, and they were perpetuating some of these myths. It was unbelievable to watch.
Oh, yeah.
Even David Bowie jumped to the fray in this. And I talk about the David Bowie story.
The thing that's interesting is that the photograph in the New York Times, the one that we're talking about, that, you know, illustrated clearly that there was no dripping. So I came to find out that Q magazine had run a photograph that he had taken because he had gone to PS 122. And we're teaching now, because I have this is a teaching moment. I have to just preface my conversation with that. We're talking about copyright and usage. So he used that photograph as a basis for an original work of art that he created, where he changed it with 3 or 4 settings on Photoshop, which he used an embossing tool. He colored it, and he used a photo stamp to remove my name of the credit. So and said he was in the theater and had taken the photograph and produced 50 of them. So we sort of said, well, no, and because you know, if you've read Walter Benjamin and The Age of Art and the work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, so it wasn't an original, it was a reproduction in the newspaper. So if it was an original photograph, I would be a lot easier to say, look, but because it wasn't, and it was in the newspaper, I couldn't really say that, you know, I couldn't, I don't know, make more trouble for him, which I really didn't want to make because I really like him and I like his work. So, and also I hadn't copyrighted it. You have 180 days or 90 days. I'm not exactly sure what the time frame was, but I had left, I was in Australia when I found out. And I was 2 days too late to send in a copyright. Well, I sent it in anyway to the Copyright Office in Washington, but it was not timely. So I basically, I had to sort of say, well, this is not fair usage. So we worked out a little a deal there. And in my lawyer was able to get more protection in for photographers, that's what I was interested in. And I also wanted to get one of the original works of art. I said, oh, can I have one? But they had already, I couldn't. I was sad. And I also wanted to say, hi, how you doing? But
we've been talking about just the artists involved in the culture wars. You know, but the show at Helen Day is not just this performance work. You know, it is the work embedded in Appalachia. It is the work embedded in the daycare home for people with mental illness. It's embedded with your animals, the goats, the horses. Once a week you go to Saratoga racetrack and you're photographing them. This cloistered nun obsession you have, you've been working with cloistered nuns and
they're radical. They're true feminists. Let's just be honest.
But you know, to end on the culture wars, it's now been 30 years since you and I were rather embroiled in those times. And I got to know you then and got to just love and respect your work even more during that period. And it is so pleasurable for me to have spent now 2.5 years with you on this exhibition.
No, yeah.
Looking back at it, what are some of your thoughts or reflections on it?
Well, what happened was when the culture wars began and the theaters sort of looked like there might be a problem, I decided to go back to school and get a master's. So I went back to school. I got an MFA because I decided that I probably was going to need a job. So I thought, oh, maybe I could be a teacher. So that's the first thing that happened immediately. That's what I did. I applied to graduate school and got to work with Martha Rossler, who I adore. So, but just in terms of lessons, the important lessons is to always be, you know, you have to, for no amount of money can you ever sell out your integrity or your honesty or that of the artist, for me, who I was photographing. You can't, for no price, for no person, for anything, compromise the trust that anybody who comes in front of your camera puts in you. That's a sacred relationship between the maker and the producer of the work. So that, you know, that was something that I knew and I learned and have benefited from, because, you know, everybody that I work with, you know, knows me and trusts me and knows I would never do anything with their work without permission or, you know, for gain on my part. So that was something that I knew, but it actually crystallized during that whole thing. So the lesson I already knew, and then getting the master's, which I'm glad I did.
I think that trust that you just talked about is also throughout this exhibition of all these embedded communities that you work in. I hope so. And I think it's the power of the work. You know,
I hope so.
What I call the embedded empathy.
Right.
So,
well, you can't just go, I'm not a journalist. I mean, I love journalism, photojournalism. It's very important, but it's not what I do. So I want to have an ongoing relationship with people after the moment has been taken. So.
Well, this 45-year retrospective entitled Dona Ann McAdams, Performative Acts, at the Helen Day Art Center through the end of December. So contact Helen Day Arts. It may be Currently, as we're taping this, it's by appointment only, but they're welcoming people to come see the show. You can see it online as well, but hopefully when this airs, it'll also be in person. And it is such a great organization. And so Donna and
I can't wait to see it.
Yes. Yes. So anyway, and thank you for the Vermont Humanities Council for having Donna and I talk about the culture wars on your First Wednesday series.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be in your company, John. Always.
Mutual love.